lesson that we have is filled with a lot of really human experience, a lot of human emotion that isn't quite so clear perhaps on the surface with the passage as it's clipped out of the gospel and presented today. What we have is John asking through his disciples if Jesus is the one that's to come or if they're supposed to wait for another. And it's a really important question for John. In case you're not aware of it, the situation isn't that John just didn't feel like going to Jesus and asking himself. At this point, John has been imprisoned, and John knows, very clearly, I suspect, John knows that he's not going to ever get out of prison alive. What he's done is he's achieved his goal in life. He went out into the wilderness to proclaim the coming of the Messiah, to bring about a change of heart and a turning of the mind from regular pursuits toward the one coming, toward the advent of the gospel, the advent of Jesus who is coming into the world. You know, it's interesting that in the Advent season we have sort of a double image happening. And in the lessons that you get each year as we go through the lectionary, the lessons are sort of a double image as well. So you think on the surface that when we're celebrating Advent and going toward Christmas that we're going to talk all about the childhood stories, the birth narratives and all that sort of stuff. And we do. They come up. But they aren't the only thing. Because the advent of the Christ isn't the birth of Jesus. It really isn't. Sometimes the church gets into a pattern of following traditions and ideas that are great, but sometimes they kind of miss the actual point. And I think sometimes that's because we're supposed to remember the point. And these are just supporting ideas, right? So we think that the Advent season is about the birth of Christ, right? Because we celebrate it leading up to it in anticipation of Christmas, which is celebrating the birth of Christ. But this truly isn't the point of the Advent season. And in fact, it really isn't the point of Christmas. The birth of a child isn't the point of it. Any more than when any one of us celebrates our birthday, that it's the point of the fact that we were born somewhere, sometime, so many years ago. It isn't really the point of a birthday, is it? A birthday isn't to celebrate the fact that you popped out of your mother's womb. That's not the point. Neither then is Christmas the point. The point of a birthday is to celebrate that individual, our affection for that individual, the life of that individual. That's the reason for a birthday. If we all stayed just babies, there'd be no celebration every year. What it is a celebration of how that life has moved into another year of accomplishment, of love, of joy, even of sadness and mourning. It is the celebration of another year of life, real life. So too is Christmas a celebration of life. In fact, Christmas is the most important celebration of life because it isn't the celebration of the birth of the Messiah, it is the celebration of what the Messiah brought to us. If all that happened was a baby was born in Bethlehem, whoop-de-doo, big deal. So if we celebrate Christmas as the birth of a baby in Bethlehem, we're missing the point. But Advent and Christmas isn't about that. And that's why we have this double image happening. We have the birth stories. We have Jesus being born in Bethlehem. We have, the Magi showing up and all that stuff, angels, stars, shepherds, all that. But more so, we have stories like today. This doesn't happen when Jesus is a baby. This happens when John the Baptist is about to be killed. That's some 30 years later. And then some. Right? That's much later. Because Advent isn't about the birth of a baby. Christmas isn't about the birth of a baby. Advent and Christmas is about the revelation of the gospel, the transformation of all creation, established and begun by Jesus' life and ministry. What John is asking is the Advent question. Not, did a baby get born in Bethlehem? He didn't say that. He was just an infant at the time himself. Instead, he says, are you the one that's coming? Or are we supposed to look for somebody else? He's at the end of his life. This is very important to him in more ways than one. Not just because he's about to finish up the life that was dedicated to calling out to the people that the Messiah was coming, but rather because he himself, in an earlier story, says this is the one. But it never gets confirmed to him. Jesus doesn't come back up out of the water. He sees the Spirit of God alighting like a dove and says all the things that he says. And then Jesus says, you're right. See you later, going out into the wilderness for a while. That's not what happened. Instead, all these things are said. Jesus gives him a small smile, perhaps, turns around and walks off into the wilderness. He doesn't know that that's what is happening. This is a man facing death, locked away from everyone he knows and loves, facing the very likely possibility of cruel death, whose entire life's work seems to be in limbo. He doesn't know. He doesn't know if he did the right thing. He doesn't know if everything about his life was spent in the right direction or if he got it all wrong and wasted everything. He doesn't know. So there he is, locked away in a cold, dark, damp cell. His disciples are coming to the door. They're not able to go in so much. And he asks them the most important thing to him. They're bringing him food. They're bringing him what comfort they can. And that isn't the most important thing to him. The most important thing to him is he needs to know, before they chop his head off, if he wasted his life. He needs to know. And so, carrying on in the important message of what Advent really is, these disciples of John the Baptist go to Jesus. And they say the question to Jesus. And then we have Jesus answer. Which is always, Jesus loves to answer questions with sort of roundabout, well, look at what you see. Because, I think, Jesus wanted people to work it out for themselves, and he also kind of wanted to point out the obvious. Right? So, yeah, just anybody does these things. It's kind of the way you hear it. So he says to them, the lame can walk, the blind can see, the poor are hearing the good news. Report this. Go tell John these are the things that are happening. Because he knows that the most important element for John is that he was right, that the Messiah was coming. And John knows that's what the Messiah is about. Not about some esoteric in your head acceptance or not acceptance of the will of God, but rather the transformation of the world, the good news being preached to the poor, the benefit of humanity. That's what John knows to be the point. It is the point as well of Advent for us. When we face difficult things, we need to have that assurance. You can be the most faith-filled individual in the world. But when you face difficult times, when you face death of loved ones, when you face cruel circumstances, loss of liberty or loss of ability, when you face inability of your body to carry on with what you want to do, when you face any of this, when you face the possibility of death like John was, you can be the most faithful person. I mean, who can look at John the Baptist and say, he just didn't know what he was talking about. He didn't really believe. He believed. He did a much better job than most of us. Even John, in that difficult circumstance, doesn't know what to do. He needs that comfort. And Jesus gave that comfort in the most direct kind of way. He said, I'm not just going to say it, see it. Here's what's happening. As we prepare in Advent for the celebration of that day, that doesn't just celebrate the birth of some kid in Bethlehem, but rather celebrates the coming of the gospel that will transform the world and all the people in it. Maybe not tomorrow, but one day it will. We celebrate the coming of the gospel. That chunk of time forgotten by the creeds. That's what we celebrate. not the kid born, the stuff in between. That lovely message of love and compassion and welcome. And Jesus says to John, look at the love, the compassion, the welcome, and see that your faith was not misplaced. It's not. Christmas is the culmination, the answer to our question. Are we to wait for another, or are you the one who was promised to come? And when we reach to the Christmas day, we can see the love, the compassion, and the welcome shown and shared by people who follow after the gospel. This is the promise. This is the celebration. This is what the angels meant when they said, glory to God in the highest and peace to all people on earth.